Great. Good morning. Good morning. I'm Amy Liu. I'm the current president of Brookings, and I'm really pleased to welcome all of you here in the room today and those who have joined us on the webcast to a great discussion we're going to have very shortly about the current and potential cooperation between Japan and the United States in addressing some of the most pressing issues facing the world today. We are very fortunate, by the way, to have a delegation of distinguished Japanese lawmakers and experts with us today, several of them who have agreed to join our conversation this afternoon. We actually had a very wonderful warm-up discussion prior to this event, so I know you all are going to be primed for a very superb discussion. Now, it goes without saying that recent events such as Russia's war in Ukraine, rising tensions over Taiwan, and more have highlighted the growing dangers of the global environment. And I know for many of you in particular, what's on many people's minds also is this rising potential conflict and tension between U.S. and China and its implications for economic relationships, national security, and the widespread impact for other nations, including for our allies such as Japan and others in the global south. Alongside those issues, the developing world also faces other significant challenges, including challenges stemming from increasing energy and food prices, unsustainable debt, and other systemic challenges in the aftermath of COVID-19. Even as prosperity increases in some areas, peace and stability, as you well know, remain elusive for others. In response, the U.S. and Japan have been actively engaged in a series of global diplomatic efforts to address these and other issues. Here we see trends such as the development of more bilateral and trilateral partnerships across the Indo-Pacific, deepening ties between Asia and Europe, and a growing awareness of the need to engage more effectively with the global south to resolve some of these world issues. Global symmetry with the G7 in Japan, the G20 in India, and the APEC summit in San Francisco holds particular significance this year in light of all of these complex issues and challenges ahead. So today's panel will explore some of these potential areas of cooperation, taking stock of the viewpoints between the U.S. and our Japanese experts and lawmakers, as well as discussing the opportunities and challenges for both of our nations to coordinate in engaging with other allies in the developing world. We're going to have a program very shortly where we will hear from a group of Brookings experts and our Japanese experts and lawmakers. I am really pleased that that conversation is going to be moderated by our very own Maria Solis, Director of the Center for East Asia Policy in our foreign policy program. Before I hand things over to Maria, I'd like to remind everyone that today's discussion is live. It is on the record. For those who are joining us on the webcast, you can submit your questions and participate in this dialogue later today by sending your questions via the email address that is on the web page. It's events@brookings.edu. You can also send your questions on Twitter at #globaldiplomacy. And for the rest of you, you can certainly join the conversation using the hashtag today on social media. And with that, I'm pleased to hand the floor over to Maria. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much, Amy, for getting us off to such a great start. I want to welcome the Mount Fuji delegation. It's a pleasure to have you here at Brookings for this important conversation. And I want to thank everyone here in the audience for joining us this morning, and also to the online audience. So we already have a very good idea of the very complex set of diplomatic issues, world politics that we're going to be addressing, and the potential for Japan and the United States to work together to ameliorate some of these problems. And we're delighted to have such an excellent expert group, and I want to introduce them to all of you. I'll start with Shinichi Kitaoka, who is Professor Emeritus at the University of Tokyo. His distinguished career includes serving as the president of the Japan International Cooperation Agency, JICA, and also as ambassador extraordinary and plenipotentiary and deputy permanent representative of Japan to the United Nations. Next to him is Rui Matsukawa. She has served at the House of Councillors since 2016 as a member of the Liberal Democratic Party. She currently serves in the Committee on Foreign Affairs and Defense, and previously she served as Parliamentary Vice Minister of Defense and at the Cabinet Office. Before that, she's a seasoned diplomat. She was 20 years in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Next to Matsukawa-san is Bruce Jones, who is Senior Fellow and Director of the Project on International Order and Strategy at Brookings. He previously served as Vice President and Director for the Foreign Policy Program. Bruce's research expertise and policy experience is in international security, and his current research focus is on U.S. strategy, international order, and great power relations. And last but certainly not least, Tanvi Madan, Senior Fellow and Director of the India Project at Brookings. Tanvi's work explores India's role in the world and its foreign policy, focusing in particular on India's relations with China and the United States. She also researches the United States and India's approaches in the Indo-Pacific. So as you can see, we have really a wealth of knowledge and insight for this panel. And I think that I would like to get us started first, with some opening remarks from each of you, if I may. If you could please address what I think is really the most fundamental question, and that is, what is the role of diplomacy given the profound geopolitical divides that we are facing today? So I think that in answering this question, you may want to share your views of what is the current state of the world order, where we're at, and given this situation, what can be the contribution of diplomacy? So let me then start with Kitaoka-san, if you can share your insights. Thank you.
5 minutes.
5 minutes, yes.
Thank you very much, Milia. Actually, I'm very happy to be here after 3 years or so. 3 years ago, I was a president. As a president, I made a presentation here. Now, the invasion of Russian invasion into Ukraine was a great shock to the international community, of course, and it's a terrible violation of the commitment. And then the no change of international order by force is a very good, important, most important milestone for human beings, which was achieved in 1945 at the United Nations Charter. It was violated by the permanent member of the Security Council. It's really terrible. So we should not reward the invader on this occasion. But how is a very important and difficult question. Now, as Milia told you, I had some experience at the United Nations. Then many people are disappointed, saying that the UN is powerless. Of course, many people know that UN is powerless. But still, UN is important in order to, create a public opinion globally. And how to make it? We have to establish an overwhelming public opinion to stop Russian invasion. And from that viewpoint, what we can do for that? Now many people are working, talking about the cooperation between the G7 and G20 in Japan. But actually, and also many people are talking about the role of G20 or so, or Global South. I don't like this word of Global South very much, because Global South can be divided into two categories. One is, poverty emerging countries, like Brazil, India, blah, blah, blah. And also, the rest of the so-called Global South are weaker, poorer countries, many countries. And then how to approach to them. Just look at G20, for example. G20 includes, G7 countries plus EU, and then if we exclude those, then 12 countries remain. Then we can exclude also South Korea, Australia as the like-minded country to us. And also Mexico is also can be excluded. Then the rest of the among the rest of the countries include Russia and China. They are on the other side, Then the rest are 7 countries. We have to. Then Japan has a relatively good relations with all those 7 countries. India is a good partner of us. Indonesia is a good partner to us, and Brazil is a good partner of us, and Turkey is also a good partner of us. And then with South Africa, Saudi Arabia, Argentina, the relation is not bad. Therefore, our approach should be how to, approach those poverty emerging countries individually. That's one thing. And also for the rest of the poorer countries, how to embrace them. In this approach, still the most important tool is official development assistance. And in this area, Japan and particularly JICA has been playing a very important role. And then, as we say, official development assistance, we do not use this word very much. We call it international cooperation. We believe that, those poorer countries are not poor because of their responsibility. They are put into the situation of poverty by some structural reasons, such as colonial rule by Western countries and so forth. Therefore, we regard our cooperation has to be on an equal footing. And by this reason, JICA's cooperation is relatively highly regarded by the developing countries, though our amount of money to invest to them was not particularly big. Then this kind of approach is very important. Smaller countries are small, but they are also proud countries. From their viewpoint, from Middle Eastern countries, United States also invaded into Iraq in 2003 without appropriate resolution. And also, for many African countries are formerly the colonies of UK and France. Therefore, in this situation, we have to have a careful approach to those countries, and then not by the manner of charity. I give this to you. I give you this to you. Therefore, follow our advice. That's not a good advice. And then particularly important area is Southeast Asia, I think. We have a free and open Indo-Pacific concept, which was supported by the President Trump and President President Biden, which is one of the very few things which is supported by 2 presidents. In this area, FOIP is important, but still, if the area of Southeast Asia falls into the hand of China, then the effect will become 1/2 or 1/3 or something like that. How to embrace those countries, which is very important. In terms of the money coming from China and coming from Japan, it's very difficult for us to compete. But no country is willing to be subordinate to any big countries. Therefore, by supporting their aspiration for independence, prosperity, solidarity, we can get their support. Also, if we make, there are a lot of opinion polls to those countries. And then if we ask them, which country will be the most important to your country, then the number 1 is likely to be China, followed by the United States. But if you ask them, which is the most trustworthy country, which country do you trust most, then Japan comes first. Therefore, by the cooperation between Japan and the United States can have a very good possibility to penetrate, to support this area by supporting, but we are not competing. I don't think we are competing our influence with China over these countries, but we are trying to support the independence, solidarity, and prosperity of those countries. By so doing, we can get the support to us. This is the basic strategy, I'm thinking.
Thank you very much, Kitaoka-san. Matsukawa-san?
Thank you very much, Rui Matsukawa. I'm really happy to be here, and also I'm a Georgetown graduate, so I'm really happy to coming back to Washington, D.C. too. And I would like to sort of like not repeating what Kitaoka sensei already mentioned, because most of them I totally agree. But I would like to also as on explore a little bit more on the recognition of the present international situation and what Japan or the U.S. can do to make the place better. And I think, unfortunately, the liberal international order disease, and now that we are already entered into the power politics world, and then the world is now divided into three, as we see, like Western countries or Japan and China and Russia. I'm really too maybe blunt in terms of simplifying their explanation, and the rest. And the rest is important. That includes what people call the global south, or non-Western countries, or India, or the South Africa, or maybe the Brazil, or Turkey, or ASEAN countries. And as Kitaoka sensei mentioned, they are very different. We cannot have a monolithic view over these non-Western countries. They have their own interest and their distance to China, or how to engage with the U.S. They don't want to be overwhelmed by either of them. They want to make their interest as much as possible, protect their interest. And then so my sense is, now that in this very fluid international relations, diplomacy plays a really important role. And what kind of then diplomacy? I would say with these non-Western countries, we have to be very creative about developing a tailor-made, multi-layered diplomacy. And I think we have been doing that. We means Japan or the US has been done already pretty, I think, a good work. Let's say for Japan, Prime Minister Abe proposed the FOIP, Free and Open Indo-Pacific agenda, and then try to engage as many countries as possible to this agenda. And now, let's say, or Japan, US, and newly, changed the government of young government, South Korea, has forged a better relations among three trilateral security cooperation. And now that Japan is also proposing, when Prime Minister Kishida visited India in this March, the FOIP 2.0, and then offering, announced that Japan is committed to provide 75 billion Japanese yen to these global South countries for the establishing a better infrastructure, because Japan does believe giving these non-Western countries, like ASEAN countries or Pacific Islands countries, African countries, an option not to rely solely on China, which is important. And then Japan recently announced the OSA, Official Security Assistance, which actually Japan will provide the infrastructure or the equipment assistance to the military of the possible ASEAN countries or other countries. And then what we want to, what multi-layered tailored diplomacy, let's say, or Taiwan Straits or the South China Sea are very important sea name for Japan or South Korea or the Philippines. I mean, all this important energy or the goods go through these Taiwan Straits and then to Japan, or maybe Taiwan Straits and Tsushima Straits to South Korea. And so what I want to say is, well, we can think about like maritime cooperation, strengthening a maritime capability cooperation among these first island chain countries, namely Japan or Taiwan, Philippines, and Indonesia or Vietnam. And so my point is, we have to be creative about what is the interest of the interest of each countries are different. So we can pick up the different agendas among different grouping of the countries. And that is what I think the diplomacy for us to pursue. And then Japan and the US can cooperate very much. And lastly, let me just touch upon the, as a G7 presidency, now that the summit is very coming close, Prime Minister Kishida will host as a president of the G7 in Hiroshima summit soon. And then, of course, Ukraine war, deterring, the stop the war, aggression by Russia is most important. and assistance, commitment for the assistance for Ukraine is so important. But the other thing is very important for Japan in this region, Indo-Pacific, is Taiwan peaceful, the Taiwan Straits. We have to have a better and more deepened commitment by the G7 countries to secure the peace in Taiwan Straits and deter the possible military unification by China. And then the invited countries include India and South Korea. These countries also play an important role. So that is the other very important agenda that Japan will pursue in the G7 summit. And also, the nuclear deterrence will be a very important subject for the G7 summit, in addition, as well as the disarmament. Because Hiroshima is a place, as you may be aware, the sole place. Japan is only one country actually, had a nuclear bombing. And then how much disaster it causes, we know. So we have to have this moral obligations to disseminate information. And lastly, deterrence diplomacy is very important. We have been doing that. But what also I do think necessary is to have the direct communication with China, high level, military to military, to avoid the unnecessary and unexpected conflicts, and which is mostly, I think the Japan and also US needs to work on. And I know we are working on, and China is not responding. I really hope China should respond to this direct communication diplomacy. Otherwise, because it's not of our interest, the conflicts between the US or China. It's not an interest for the US or Japan or the region or even China. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Matsukawa-san. Bruce, please go ahead.
Thanks. I want to start with your question, Maria, sort of, does diplomacy matter in this moment or can it? And one thing I want to highlight, which has been, I think, not given much attention over the last year, is the very important role that the G7 itself has played on dealing with Ukraine. Already by the anniversary of the Ukraine war, February 24th, the G7 political directors or foreign ministers had met 70 times, 7-0, for political and economic coordination of strategy in response to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, on sanctions, on diplomacy, on the whole range of issues. We've never seen anything like that in the history of the G7, right? So G7 has actually emerged as an extremely important political diplomatic mechanism for dealing with the Ukraine crisis. That hasn't been much commented on in the public space, but I think it's an important illustration of the way that diplomacy can, or diplomatic mechanisms can play roles. But of course, diplomacy has only ever worked, in all of history, diplomacy has only ever worked when embedded in a wider strategy that links deterrence, diplomacy, and economic development, right? And so that, to me, is the challenge in front of us. How do we understand the relationship between deterrence, diplomacy, and development in the contemporary geopolitical moment? Just maybe make a couple of quick comments on that. First of all, I think there's a lot of opportunity for greater collaboration within that framework for U.S. Japan, other countries in the region. I loved your idea of a first island chain maritime cooperation. I would add Australia to that with the AUKUS framework. So there's a lot of opportunity there in the deterrence space. There's a lot of opportunity, for example, with the United States and Japan and Australia as well now to increase anti-submarine warfare partnerships and et cetera. We have good relations. We do not have operational coordination in the military space, anything remotely like what happens in the European theater, for example. So there's a lot of room to grow that maritime cooperation in those crucial waterways that you described. And I think in a range of other areas too, we could see growing cooperation among that group of countries. Some of it's G7, some of it's Quad, some of it's AUKUS, and indeed, it seems to me that there's a case for increasingly linking the G7 and the Quad as the kind of two core bodies grappling with the deterrence, economic, and strategic questions in that region. We use different terms for things, we call things differently, et cetera, but really that sort of Quad plus 7 links some of the key countries. We do have to bring South Korea in some fashion. By the way, on diplomacy, I think it's extremely important that we had the South Korean visit to Tokyo, and now Kishida is going to Seoul. One of the things that I would hope that he does when he's there is to publicly welcome the new Washington Declaration between the United States and South Korea on expanding extended deterrence. I think that would be a very positive signal in Japan in trilateral diplomacy if he were to publicly welcome that development. But there's a lot of opportunity in that Quad G7 space. The challenge, it seems to me, goes to the issue that Dr. Kitowaka raised. What is the response to non-Western emerging powers who want a greater share of the pie, who want a more equitable global governance system, who want a larger seat at the table? And have reason to demand that, every reason they've been demanding it for 20 years, and the West has frankly been very recalcitrant in opening up global governance arrangements to those actors, and we see the cost. They're increasingly disaffected, they're increasingly looking to other venues, or at least some, right? It's correct to say we should be differentiated. China is helping us here by sort of pushing some countries in our direction on security issues. In economic and developmental and diplomatic terms, it's much more complicated. And the challenge we're going to confront, if we put it bluntly, is that most of the things that we will want to do as G7 or G7 plus Quad to limit the space for China are going to be the exact opposite of the things that we would do if we were operating in a kind of G20 plus world to kind of open up more space. It's possible to reconcile these two things, but we're not doing it. We're not actually implementing policies that would create more space for Brazil or for South Africa and trade regimes, et cetera. We're doing the opposite. I don't think it's quite fair to say that Jake Sullivan on this stage sort of took a knife to the WTO throat, but he certainly didn't do it any good. And of course, what's a key demand for if you're South Africa or Indonesia is to kind of have greater access to the WTO or greater access to the IMF, right? So these two things are in deep tension. And how we reconcile that, I think, is going to be the key challenge ahead of us. So I would be keen to see if we can build on the Japanese chairmanship of the G7, we have Italy and then Canada, to see if we can develop a strategy that would link deterrence, diplomacy, and the development strategy that could bring in, or at least create some opportunities for the non-Western emerging powers.
Thank you, Bruce. That was terrific. Tambi, please go ahead.
Thank you, Maria. I think my comments will somewhat kind of build on what Bruce talked about, which is partly kind of thinking about diplomacy in a broader context and in its different dimensions as well. I mean, if we think about the international order today, the term that I often think of is it's being stress tested. And in some ways, the signals are not great, but in other ways, if anything, the stresses are showing us how essential diplomacy really is. And if we think about some of the tensions and the stresses that we've seen to the international system in recent years, whether that's the Russian invasion of Ukraine, whether that's Chinese assertiveness in the Indo-Pacific, whether that's frankly our failure to coordinate diplomatically in responding to the pandemic, these are kind of departures. One of the problems has been these are departures from the use of diplomacy. In some cases to kind of turn to force or coercion or turning insular as we all became nationalists during COVID and protectionists to a certain extent. So it's kind of this failure of communications, of diplomacy to move away from it, which to me shows that actually this is an important instrument that we need to kind of go back to. Also, to reinforce through diplomacy the importance of the rules, laws, and norms that have on balance benefited even countries like China and Russia that question the international order or its representativeness overall. I think crucial aspect of diplomacy and why it remains essential is not just thinking about diplomacy in terms of partners, and I'll come to the whatever term we want to use for the so-called global south, emerging non-Western emerging world, but in terms of actually engaging rivals. The channels of communication that need to be built to manage rivalries, to ensure that there's crisis communication, to prevent those crises in the first place. We do need to kind of be aware that we have to have these communication channels to ensure that whatever tensions there are, and it is a more competitive international order, don't spill over into a crisis, whether by kind of deliberate intent or frankly by accident, in which case we need these mechanisms. So diplomacy in terms of being essential to establish and maintain these channels of communication. Second, and this is somewhat related to what Bruce said, there was much talk about kind of integrated deterrence and what that means. Diplomacy is an essential part of deterrence. In addition to things that Bruce talked about, there's the signaling your rivals. That is not just a military effort, though that's obviously, as Bruce talked about, a crucial dimension of it. There is a diplomatic element to that. There's also a diplomatic element and diplomacy element to building coalitions to deter, whether it is or groupings like AUKUS or the Quad. There's also a Quad summit coming up just after the G7 and before the G20. So I think in terms of coalition building for deterrence, but not just for building deterrence. As we think about, we've talked about the world outside the West, we have to offer positive solutions as well. And diplomacy comes in those different aspects that we often forget about, but things like economic diplomacy, whether that is in terms of resolving problems that many countries face, or it is building their resilience so that we can help them help themselves. Thinking about countries and diplomatically engaging with them on what they would like from us, as opposed to here is what we're bringing to you. So it's a crucial, I think, dimension on that aspect as well. Defense diplomacy, a crucial aspect, again, of building resilience of various countries in key parts of the world, but more broadly as well. Another aspect of diplomacy, I think, again, that we need to recall, remember, and relearn is public diplomacy and strategic communications. And I mean this in both elements. One, actually, in a positive sense, highlighting where, for example, where we are offering positive solutions, what kind of solutions we are offering, high-quality solutions, talking about we are not pressing countries to choose, but we are offering choice. That should be kind of a positive aspect of public diplomacy and strategic communications. But I think we also need to use public diplomacy to frankly call out violations of the rules-based order. And not both sides this all the time as we sometimes do. Whether that is invasions, whether that's the use of economic coercion, whether that is hostage-taking that countries engage in, countries like Russia and China. And I think we need to call them out because we need to, when we're talking about stresses to the system, if we don't call them out, then we can't actually resolve them. And then finally, I'll just add kind of, we talk much about the failure of the international order. We talked about stresses to kind of the multilateral system. But it still matters because we can talk about the G7, we can even talk about the G20, which is somewhat more representative. We can talk about the Quad and AUKUS. But the multilateral system and the UN system in particular is still the one place. It's like an annual general meeting as opposed to kind of a closed-door board meeting. And that is where everybody gets a voice. And so you have countries talking about themselves as, voices of the global south, and, I'm glad that they do. But countries themselves should have their own voices and votes. And I think this is a place where the multilateral system matters. It is going to be a place where we see competition play out. It is going to be a place where standards are set. And where the rules-based order is going to be discussed and what those rules are. So I think it's important to continue to engage and reinvest in multilateral diplomacy, even while recognizing that it needs to be reformed and revitalized, to be made more accountable, to be made more representative in a way that it is not today.
Thank you very much, Damien. Actually, you end where I want to take the conversation next. Because it seems to me that diplomacy certainly matters, and we are seeing how, the G7 and NATO and other groups, organizations have really sprung into action dealing with this profound crisis. But I think that, to be provocative, you could call that club diplomacy, right? That's still a small number of countries, like-minded, but perhaps that's not enough to solve the issues that we're facing. And it's similar to the dynamics we see on the economic front with the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, with the CPTPP, and where is the WTO? Perhaps in life support. So I'm going to be very provocative here, but just to, maybe I'll regret it, but I just used life support to talk about WTO. Should we use that term to talk about the UN? I mean, it seems like this is the ultimate test, right? With the Ukraine war. Has the UN really stood up and delivered on its mission? And are the US and Japan investing in UN diplomacy enough? And what streams of work are potentially very constructive coming from the UN on the particular set of issues that you've all touched on? Kitaoka-san, you have your...
Sorry about that. Okay, UN has not been playing enough role, of course, no, unfortunately. But still, you know, if we continue to establish an overwhelming majority against Russia, then they pretend, Russian people, Russian leaders pretend that they don't care, but actually they care. Actually, if as much majority we create, then it makes China a little bit difficult to come closer to Russia. Therefore, by so doing, we have to apply the diplomatic pressure to them. And also, I believe I have spoken about how we should do that. Then also in other area of, let me go a little bit on a different topic, G20, for example. In 2019, I advised Prime Minister Abe to do what I'm going to tell you. China has been, you know, playing an important role of lender. They lend a lot of money to many developing countries. But they are not a member of OECD, therefore they are not bound by the rule. They can ignore the consideration about the debt sustainability. They can ignore the environmental issue. Therefore, I advised Prime Minister Abe, and then he did much effort to decide among G20 countries so that all the countries have to respect those regulations which are laid down by OECD. Of course, they can be, you know, I don't believe that they will respect their promise always, but still that can be some pressure. Therefore, there's only also one reason to make use of G20. And also, I found that Secretary General Guterres pointed out that G20 as a whole has a responsibility to lend money to the more poorer countries. This is, you know, to say the responsibility of the, you know, bigger part of the global South countries to help others. You know, therefore, there are many ways to engage in diplomacy. Nothing is decisive. But still we have to accumulate a lot of effort on every front to create some pressure, and so that we can come back to the important agreement of non-change of status quo by force.
Thank you very much, Kitaoka-san. Any other comments? Matsukawa-san.
I think with the UN or the like APEC or G20, these large number of the countries, the framework has its independent meaning. Although I think it's pretty clear that UN has a limitation, especially when the Security Council member is invading their neighbor country, outright in the daytime. I mean, there certainly is a restriction, and I think that's the reason why the UN reform is necessary. But that being said, I think still the UN, because it's only one sole body, where almost all the countries of the world, the members. So it is a place for creating an international opinion, rather. This is a place where not necessarily we cannot have the Security Council resolution because Russia is there, but with the General Assembly's resolution, I think it's important to recover the international norms, or like especially the rule-based international order, and then not necessarily the economic sanctions all the members can agree. Actually, it's pretty limited. But that being said, criticizing Russia's invasion, 141 countries agreed which is, the ultimate, outstanding majority. And so I think UN still has a great role in terms of creating an international opinion. And then the other thing is, just like November, where the G20 or the APEC held in Indonesia and Thailand became a platform for variety of the diplomacy. Well, of course, the meeting itself is one thing, but at the side of the G20, at the side of the APEC, these countries can have the bilateral talks, trilateral talks. So I think this big framework actually offers a safe platform for any countries which has a difficult relations can talk. U.S. had our summit meeting with China at the side of, I think, G20. Japan had a Japan-China summit meeting at the side of, which was it? G20 or APEC. But anyway, that's the other virtue for the large framework. So I think it's important to continue to hold it. And lastly, the UN can play a role for the reconstruction, not necessarily making the forceful resolution, but I think still the UN can play has been and is playing and is going to play the role for the recovery or the reconstruction of devastated places like Ukraine. So
Thank you very much. Bruce and Tammy, you also have some response.
Just briefly, I think we have to be very careful in writing off the UN at this moment, right? Did it stop the war? No, it's rarely the case that the UN stops wars. What it does do is create mechanisms, as you just said, for the major powers to step off the brink or to, eventually step away from crisis, and we don't want to close down those channels. And in the meantime, the Black Sea grain deal, which was negotiated by the Turks and the UN, but necessarily the UN as part of that, has saved tens of millions of lives. So in terms of limiting the fallout from it, so we have to be careful. I didn't mention it up front, and it's a controversial point, but I do actually think that we should get back to the agenda of council reform. Biden made a point of saying this when he was at the General Assembly last year, or it's been tried before, it never succeeds, blah, 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 we all know that. But actually in the modern moment, we've never had a moment when the United States actually chose to lead an effort on reform diplomacy. The kind of posture is, oh, sure, we'll be willing to see a Japanese or an Indian seat if somebody else makes it happen, knowing full well that nobody else will be able to make it happen. I actually think we should shift gears on that, and that we, the United States, should actually lead an effort to expand participation in the Council, Japan, India, South Africa, Brazil, others. And the chances are that the Russians and the Chinese will mobilize against it and block it. Okay, let them. I think we would gain from that diplomatically, and if it succeeded, we'd gain from it institutionally. So I think it's a kind of a no-win, no-lose for us to tackle this and actually lead, not just say, oh, we'd be willing to see it happen if it happened by some magic that we can't describe.
Thank you. Tammy?
Just very quickly, and it builds on what Bruce said, which is it is anachronistic today, and has been for years, that 3 out of the 5 permanent members of the Security Council are European countries. And the only thing, frankly, today, they're not the largest economies in the world, they're not the largest militaries. The only thing they have in common, and think about the message it sends, is they were the first 5 countries to get nuclear weapons. That is what the P5 has in common. So I think without a serious attempt at reform, you are going to see these coalitions, these like-minded coalitions building, because it is not working. After all, even in terms of the WTO, it was a sense that it wasn't working in terms of a multilateral framework that we first went to a TPP and a plurilateral, what we call coalitions today. And so I think we're not going to see the end of multilateralism, much as we're not, people talk about deglobalization. No, it's going to be a different kind of globalization. I think the same thing is true of the international order. It's not going to be no more multilateralism, and I don't think that would be healthy. I think it's going to be a different kind of multilateralism where the UN system will still be important, including not just the UN Security Council or the General Assembly. And that is important partly because I remember the Bhutanese representative last year, the Kenyan representative's comments about the Russian invasion got a lot of attention. I believe Prime Minister Kishida is in Kenya right now. But the Bhutanese representative, this is a small country stuck between two very, very large countries. And the importance for this country that has membership of the UN General Assembly said, these aren't just abstract principles for us at the UN, these are the guarantors of our very existence. So I think there is that aspect that matters, but I think the second part of it is there are these other parts of the UN that we often don't think about in these organizations that do play a key role in development, in kind of peacekeeping, in the ITU, the telecommunications and technology unions, the World Health Organization. We don't want to throw these out. We want to strengthen them. But I think simultaneously in this different kind of multilateralism, we'll see this coalition building as well.
Thank you very much. So then let's shift gears, and I would like to talk about international summit. We have a very busy calendar this year, and of course, in a few days, it's the G7 in Hiroshima. And we heard already that this is a rejuvenated G7 because, of the Ukraine crisis and how it has been a focal point for coordination in a response to that significant crisis. But I would say that it's also a different G7 because the host itself is transformed. I mean, Japan is welcoming these countries after having gone to very profound security reforms. And, the new goal of 2% of GDP defense expenditures, the new national security strategy. There's a lot happening in Japan. And the way in which Prime Minister Kishida condemned very forcefully the invasion of Ukraine and made sure that it was not just a transatlantic response, but a G7 response. And therefore, the sanctions have been G7 and with other partners like South Korea. So, and we know that hosts set the agenda. That is what being a president or chair a country means. So I'm going to throw a lot of questions because you provide excellent but long answers. So I want to make sure we cover all of this. What difference does it make that Japan is hosting the G7 after this security transformation? And what would be the objectives of Japan in the G7? And perhaps the most controversial question, I hope, or the one that generates also a lot of discussion is, are the G7 countries truly aligned? When it comes, I think, to pushing back against Russia, yes. But what about when it comes to deterring China? Because China is not using yet kinetic force, it's engaging in gray zone activities, coercion without violence, because China is a much larger economy. And, taking into account what President Macron said on his return from China, do we think that because it's in Hiroshima, obviously the Indo-Pacific is going to loom large, the security situation in the Pacific. So, two questions. Japan's security transformation and its role as host, and alignment of the G7 in addressing not just the Europe theater, but the Indo-Pacific theater. So, let's get started. Kitaoka-san.
There are two very big questions. One is that about the Security Council reform. Reform of the security policy in Japan. I think these changes are very much fundamental, and then these took place starting from Abe administration, first in 2006, and then secondly from 2012. Then many things have been changed. In this respect, as you know, that Article 9 of Constitution is very well known. And then the first half of Article 9 is okay, the same as the UN Charter, no use of force to change the Constitution, to solve the international disputes. But second is, no possession of military forces, which was the handicap, which was constraints for Japan's playing important role overseas, which was gradually changing. And then now, in a sense, Germany was divided into two camps, East and West. Japan was divided into two camps. A majority were pragmatic pacifism. They believe in economic development more important. Then still they thought that some military forces are necessary. The other side, minority side, was very much literally committed to the latter half of the Article 9, no possession of military forces. And in this relationship, the majority side, represented by Liberal Democratic Party, made a lot of compromises to persuade those minorities. I would say unnecessary compromises, so that we will not dispatch self-defense forces overseas. We will fight for ourselves, but we will not fight for other countries, blah, blah, blah. But these are very utopian ideas. You know, in order to support international order, peace and order, you have to play some important role in security too. And also, you know, there was another compromise they made, such as, you know, the budget has to be within 1% of GDP, or we will not encourage any research on the military-related area. But because of that, Japan's military industry declined, so that we cannot make an important military contribution to help us, Ukraine, very much. These are changing because we saw the reality. Ukraine was invaded, and also China is becoming more and more of a real threat to us. By which I'm trying to say that these changes are irreversible. And then these changes will be accelerated in the future, so that Japan can play a more important role to support international peace and order. Sorry, let me go to the second point. Still the most important issue in G7 summit meeting is partly because Prime Minister Kishida was from Hiroshima, so to show the people Hiroshima, then that's his lifelong commitment to abolition to the nuclear weapons. Many people may agree with the abolition of nuclear weapons in the long run, but now we face a more imminent danger that Putin is suggesting, the possibility of using nuclear weapons. So we have to make it clear that no country should be allowed to use nuclear weapons, including the threatening it. Therefore, you know, it's very important to show, to get together at Hiroshima and to convince about the no use of nuclear weapons. Can I get one more minute? Actually, as you may know, Bruce may know it very well, you know, Japan is now a Security Council member, non-permanent member. And then each member has a right to be a president of a Security Council. It comes every 15 months. Japan was the president of the Security Council in January this year. And next year, we will host the will be the president next time, April next year. And then the president has a privilege to invite you know, summit meeting on certain topic. And then there are also 2 cases in the past that the presidential country invited, you know, decided to open, to have a meeting in other places than New York, okay? So my idea is that, which I have been speaking to the public in Japan, how about, you know, making a summit meeting when Japan was a president, Japan will be a president next time in Hiroshima on nuclear issue. And then by so doing, I'm very much hoping that Xi Jinping may come and Putin may come if he's not afraid of being arrested. But anyhow, we will guarantee that he will not be arrested. And then I'd like to show, it's very shocking to show Hiroshima, you know. And then I'm very much willing to go ahead, not only this time, but also to another opportunity next year.
Thank you very much. Reactions? Maybe I changed the order a little bit. So Tanvi, Bruce, and Matsukawa-san. And then we still have the Global South and questions.
I was going to say, maybe I'll give a pass and move to Bruce so that in the interest of time.
No, Tanvi, go ahead.
I think, you know, one of the things I would just caution in terms of, and I think it's very good to see Japan having invited other countries, but as much as it's been good to see a kind of the re-emergence of the G7, there's a little bit of a danger as we talk about the Global South so much, that it sees the G7 as a closed club, and frankly sees it and this has been very effective, Russian strategic communications, as the source of their problems in terms of higher commodity prices, etc. because they see, many countries will see the G7 as where, the West gets together and decides to sanction, to put sanctions in place. Sanctions that don't just end up affecting Russia, but, their prices as well. So I just kind of caution that we need to make sure that those kind of concerns are, even in communications, handled well in a summit like that.
Great points. Thank you. Bruce?
Just very briefly on your second question, whether we're actually unified on China. And it strikes me it's a kind of odd moment where we're more unified in practice than we are rhetorically. So Macron goes to Beijing and says a bunch of stuff, and everybody in the United States goes bananas and et cetera, and Schultz signs trade deals, and everybody here freaks out. Meanwhile, U.S. trade with China was at its highest point last year in history, okay, right? Both France and Britain are doing useful things to help Australia and India and other countries expand their naval capability in the Western Pacific. That has one role, which is to constrain the Chinese, right? So on both the economic side, the reality is closer than the rhetoric would suggest, and there's more going on in the strategic side than the diplomacy sort of talks about. So it's an odd reality. I think there's more there than meets the eye.
Thank you very much. Matsukawa-san.
Thank you. Miria-san, I think because Japan is the only one Asian member among the G7 countries, and which is going to be held in Hiroshima this time, I think Japan will play, needs to, and will play a very unique, important role for pivoting the G7 of the majorly European, US, these Western countries club, but at the same time has a more, the benign and access and linkage to ASEAN countries or Pacific Islands countries and Indo-Pacific at large. And that is a role for Japan to play. And so this time summit for Japan, and I think for the Indo-Pacific nations, most important question is actually the China. I mean, I don't know whether we call it or not, but deterring the possible Taiwan crisis or the peace in stability in Indo-Pacific. And responding to your two posed questions, Japan has made last year, at the end of last year, issued a new national security strategy, which is a major security transformation. In a sense that Japan has decided to protect our nation by ourselves. And it's, of course, a matter of course, you have to protect your nation by yourself. Even though you have allies, you have to make utmost efforts. But so far, Japan has lots of restrictions. And then this time, with this security strategy, Japan will make utmost efforts by increasing the budget, but at the same time, we will try to have our own deterrence capability by possessing a long-range missiles, or the other developing the new capabilities in the cyber or the space or the other new fields, and then also employing the military-civil technologies, which has no boundary. Technology has no boundary between the military or the civil. So we will, GOJ will make efforts to have a better technological developments in defense. So in many ways, Japan has decided to enhance our defense capability significantly. To do what? To deter any possible conflicts in this region. And then that's because the U.S.-China power balance has been shifted to, still U.S. is 3 times stronger in terms of the military budget than China, but still it's the balance of the military power balance has been shifted to much closer, closer. So these things are necessary from the defense perspective, but at the same time, it's really important for making the diplomacy that's been described here being effective. Because with China, or with Russia, with North Korea, these surrounding countries, when you would like to have a effective diplomacy, you have to have strength. Just nice words doesn't make any delivery to these countries, as you could imagine. So that's important. And then G7 again, with China question, as President Macron sort of alluded to, well, I think that holds some truth. I mean, even though you say it not, I mean, So that's exactly the reason why this time G7 needs to have a very unified view and also the action for protecting the peace and stability in this Indo-Pacific. So I'm hoping that the Prime Minister Kishida and Japan will play an important role for pivoting and linkaging these G7 White Club to a larger, the region, plus the China question, Indo-Pacific region, peace and stability will be the major issues. And Kitaoka-sensei already mentioned, so I wouldn't repeat it. Of course, nuclear deterrence and disarmament is also very important, considering that it is taking place in Hiroshima. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So 5 more minutes of moderated conversation, and then I want to bring the audience. I want to talk about the Global South. That, I think if someone did a Google word search, probably there has been a peak in the number of the times that word appears. But it's probably not the best way to engage in the developing world, because it's like trying to put a very diverse set of countries in that one homogeneous label. So I think that that's probably not probably going to stick for long, because I don't think it really will work. And that's why we've had already suggestions as to how we should address this. My own suggestion is inclusive diplomacy. Or omnidirectional diplomacy. I mean, something that just shows that you're going to have a more specific, nuanced approach to different regions and different countries. But, what is driving the interest in engaging with the developing world, I think, is a fundamental question. Is it a more instrumental take on, well, we were shocked by those votes in the General Assembly that they did not condemned the invasion of Russia, or is it driven by the needs of the developing world, given the debt crisis, given the very serious economic issues that they're facing? And added to this, I think it's very interesting that Prime Minister Kishida recently in India announced, as Matsukawa-san mentioned, this relaunch of the free and open Indo-Pacific. And the question I have is that it seems to me that we're in a transition point in Japanese diplomacy, and I would love your take on whether I'm reading this correctly or not. And that is that the proof of concept is that Japan is trying to have what started as regional concepts transcend those regional boundaries. So the idea is that the principles that, a peaceful and stable international system derives from rule of law, from deterring coercion, from freedom of navigation. All these principles have universal value. And you may have coined them with a specific regional label, but actually they can travel further. I see this, for example, in the CPTPP, the Comprehensive and Progressive TPP. I mean, UK is a member. You look at the map. It's not because of geography. It's because they're willing to live by these rules and these principles. But can this work? Will you stretch it too thin or not? Can you actually provide the resources? Because $75 billion is very welcome. But when you now talk about free and open Indo-Pacific, covering the Middle East, Latin America, I mean, these other areas, you're not going to have a lot of gas to run that engine, I would say. So again, trying to be a little bit controversial here. 5 minutes, and then the audience needs to have a say. Kitaoka-san.
Thank you very much. We know that the concept of freedom, free and open Indo-Pacific was declared by Prime Minister Abe in 2016. But there was a precedent before that. One announcement was made by Foreign Minister Aso in 2006 in Uzbekistan. He just said that there should be the arc of freedom and prosperity, meaning that in order to have a continuous sustainable development, you have to have a system in which people's voice is heard and people can participate in politics. So this is, not related to the region. Therefore, this is to encourage those countries which are newly born from Soviet Union. This can be applied to all the world. And also there are some other conditions. For example, when we look at Latin American countries, they are mostly against Russia on this issue. In the first voting in March last year, overwhelmingly they were supportive of the resolution against Russia, unlike African countries. Therefore, we have to make tailored approach. That's what we are meaning. And then considering the economic level, the distance from Russia and others. Say, for example, in Southeast Asia, Cambodia, which was regarded to be very close to China, opposed to Russia on 3 occasions. And then, on the other hand, Vietnam, which was, very close in many foreign policies to Japan, was a bit close to Russia because of their military relations. So that's why I agree with Matsukawa-san about the necessity of a tailored approach to every country.
Thank you very much. So 1 minute response and then questions. Anything you want to telegraph to the audience?
I can jump in. I'd just say, I think, as we think about, I'll give an example in my 1 minute, what we need to offer countries outside. I think about my hometown, Delhi, and the transformation that one single project funded by a low-cost loan from Japan, the Delhi metro system, it transformed the city. Amy Liu, who's sitting here, led a program on cities of engines of growth. And in Delhi, the metro has been an engine of growth. And that is a single project. And what does it do? It wasn't just about a donor kind of recipient. It was about an economic partnership. And so I think when we approach the let's call it the Global South for just a short form, it can't be about, you guys are basket cases, we're going to come and solve your problems. I think it has to be, yes, providing solutions where possible for immediate problems, including debt restructuring, which I think at both the G7 and the G20 is going to be a big focus, but also long-term building resilience. And that means investing in those countries and helping them with their physical infrastructure. We talk about it a lot in terms of connectivity, including digital connectivity, but equally important social infrastructure, human development, health security, thinking about their kind of food security, etc. So I think thinking about that. One thing I just will add, I think geography still matters. As much as we talk about one theater these days, the fact that a country like India is, let's just say, non-aligned between the Russia and the West, but it is aligned when it comes to China, in balancing China. That's about geography. And therefore, I think you will see the difference in the G7. Yes, Europe will always have a different view on China, or not as converging as, say, Japan, Australia, US, and India will have. Because I think geography does matter at the end of the day, no matter how much technology has helped us close that gap.
So it's geopolitics and diplomacy. So let me then open it for the audience. There are mics going around. I'm going to take 2 questions at a time. If you can raise your hand, and we'll bring the mic to you. We have one question here in the center. Please identify yourself and be very concise. So we'll go next to you.
Thank you. My name is Tai Sasaki, and I'm a graduate student at Georgetown. So I'm myself a student, like Matsukawa sensei. I have a question about the anti-hegemonic coalition against China. So I guess the major and viable players who can contribute to the anti-hegemonic coalition in the Indo-Pacific region are Japan, Australia, India, and of course the US. Do you think this is enough, or would you expect Europeans and other Southeast Asian countries to contribute to this anti-hegemonic coalition? Thank you.
Thank you very much. And then the gentleman here.
Hello, my name is Nick Velez. I'm a graduate student at Johns Hopkins SAIS. Thank you very much for this very insightful discussion. My question, which will be very brief, is about BRICS. Is it something that G7 should react towards, see it positively, or do you think this is something that's very ephemeral? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Responses from the panel?
I can jump in very quickly on the BRICS. I think the G7 shouldn't overreact. It has internal tensions within it, including really bad India-China relations at the moment that will limit what it can do. I also think about the fact that the BRICS has a new development bank that is not giving loans to Russia right now. So, there are these contradictions built in within. Nonetheless, I think there's a serious Sino-Russian effort to expand the BRICS, and I think to make it an alternative G20. And so I think there is this, and I think in some ways, that's something to watch, but not overreact to, because I think, it's much like talking about an anti-hegemonic coalition. If we frame things that way, it won't be seen as inclusive, you'll get less membership. And so even with the BRICS, it's about offering positive alternatives rather than going after them. Or right now the Shanghai Cooperation Organization Ministerial is being held. These kind of groupings, they will come up. They are also coalitions like-minded on some things, but I think we've also seen their limitations. I think about the SCO. It's supposed to be a regional security organization. One member has invaded another country, another member is coercing other members, a third kind of, member is sponsoring or is the home ground for a number of terrorist groups. So there are contradictions within these organizations. I'd let them play out while watching and making sure that China and Russia's efforts to make them anti-West groupings as opposed to non-West groupings is constrained.
Matsukawa-san.
I'll take up the Sasaki-san's question as to my Georgetown friends. Well, just responding to your anti-hegemonic coalition question, it depends on the whether we're talking about the defense, military, cooperation, or much larger political, economic, security cooperation. And I think if we talk about the military, coalition, India is not there. India Quad is a political, political at most, the grouping, and not the military cooperation grouping. But that being said, you can see like Indo-Pacific are, the military drill is often taking place together with India, these Quad countries or the others together. And so if it is a military part, we want more partners like UK or the other European countries, which has a strategic interest of keeping the peace in this Indo-Pacific, needs to be the partner too. But that's being said, I think I see the world in a much more gradualism. Even though like President Macron said, Taiwan, thing, and then, well, China is a huge economic market, and it has a technology, and it's a military power, and it has not necessarily great allies, but many friends or the followers in the world. And then, well, Philippines, President Marcos came, visited U.S. yesterday, and then he said for more access for the U.S. military in the Philippines. That is reaction to defending his nations from Chinese possible, But that doesn't mean like Philippines will cut off the relation with China in terms of the economy, right? So my response is, well, it's not a number does matter, but it depends on the agenda, and also you cannot really expect 100% for this country on this or that. It's okay, 60% from India and 30% from UK, let's say. Well, but will enhance the deterrence as a whole and give the option to the non-Western countries, not just depending on China. That is important. Well, India and the US or the Japan doesn't cut off. We'll have the, as Bruce pointed out, US enjoyed the largest amount of trade with China last year. So world is not that simple. So that's my answer. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And the last words, Kitaoka-san.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'd like to say a few words about India and China, respectively. Now creditors meeting is going on in Sri Lanka. That's very important, China is not a member of the OECD, therefore they are not bound by the rule of OECD, but still, they are very much responsible for lending a lot of money to Sri Lanka, which Sri Lanka cannot pay it back. Why do those countries borrow money from China? It's a question, because interest rate is high. Still they borrow the money from China because it's very convenient and they can make a quick decision very much. And also I suspect there can be bribery involved in it. Therefore, our effort is to promote the transparency of the financial system in those recipient countries. That's we are working on. So whether China will take the responsibility for being a creditor to Sri Lanka in it is a very important thing. We have to watch carefully. Secondly, our relation with India is very deep and strong, I guess. You know, we have very good relations from ancient time, but still, our first destination of our official development assistance was India in the 1950s. But it was, prevented from deepening because of the Indian policy of, socialization, social system, and so forth, socialism. And then, therefore, the end of the Cold War had a big impact on Indian policy. So India began to change to be included in the international political and economic system. But the relationship between Japan and India was a little bit, suspended from deepening because of the nuclear test in the 1990s. But after that, we began to become closer, and then by creating a Japan-India Wise Men's Meeting, and I was appointed to be a member of that meeting. And in addition to that, we worked very closely together at the United Nations to support the Security Council reform. And also, finally, the very close relationship between Prime Minister Abe and Prime Minister Modi became the basis of that. Therefore, the Japan-India relation is, in a sense, the most very important basis of Quad, as well as the Japan-US Security Treaty. And also, it's a basis for many international cooperation. Therefore, it's very important to have a chairmanship, presidency in G20 and G7 at the same time. But still, many things are remaining to be done. For example, people-to-people contact. If you look at the number of the students in Tokyo University from China, there are more than 3,000 students. But in India, less than 100. We have to promote more of the student exchange, scholars exchange. That will deepen our relationship even more, and then to contribute to the stability and peace in the world.
Thank you very much, Kitaoka-san. Bruce, your last comment?
Just very briefly, and it's partly a response to some of the questions about BRICS, partly your last. I'm absolutely convinced that we will continue to lose ground with the major players of the, quote, global south, the kind of non-Western emerging powers, until we are willing to give ground on the governance of core international financial and development institutions. I mean, is it really in Germany's core fundamental interest to keep hold of the leadership of the UN Development Program? Is it so fundamental to American grand strategy to have another American at the head of the World Bank? Do we really think the Europeans are going to give ground when Kristalina steps down and we might sort of have other candidates for the IMF? We're so recalcitrant. So we want to go out there diplomatically and say, why don't you support the rules-based order, whatever the hell that is? They don't get a say in the writing of the rules, and the rules aren't particularly good for them. So why the hell should they? I mean, in the economic space, right? In the strategic space, it's a little bit different. So unless and until we are willing to give ground on the management of the global financial and economic and development system, we will not succeed in limiting the appeal of alternative mechanisms like the economic facets of the BRICS.
Thank you very much. Thank you for such a terrific, insightful discussion. Please join me in thanking our panelists.